Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us, both those of you who are in the room and those of you who are joining us online. My name is Gaston Alonso, and I'm the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. And I am very excited to welcome you to today's event. This is the third in an eight-part series that we are hosting to celebrate recent books by Brooklyn College faculty. And today, in this case, I get to say books by Brooklyn College faculty and Brooklyn College students. Today we celebrate Until We Are Seen, public college students expose the hidden inequalities of the COVID-19 pandemic. This volume is edited by Brooklyn College English professor Joseph Entin and distinguished professor of political science Jeanne Theoharis. And it brings together the writers from both Brooklyn College and Cal State Los Angeles, many of which are here today. We are honored to host you, and we are excited for the conversation ahead. Now, can I have all of you who were involved in putting this fantastic book together stand up? And can the rest of us give them a round of applause? Now, two quick announcements. First, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be housed in the Wolf Institute YouTube channel. Second, if you're a student and you didn't sign in on the way in, please make sure you sign in on the way out. Okay, now, this book chronicles the COVID-19 devastating and disproportionate effects on working class communities of color. I think as such, the book provides us with a way to remember, to look back, to work through the devastation that the pandemic encountered. And yes, the devastation was already there in these communities. And then the devastation that the pandemic furthered. The book, I think, also allows us to look forward, to understand what are the structural forces that contributed to the high rates of sickness, of suffering, of death in these communities, so that perhaps and hopefully we can imagine and we can create a better world. I'm going to leave the authors of the book tell you about it, no spoilers from me. But I do have to say that this event is particularly joyful for me. And I cry at these things a lot. But especially when I get to be so proud of my students. Many of you were my students, or currently are my students. And I am just incredibly proud of this work. The late feminist scholar Bell Hooks, someone whose work was foundational in my college education. In her 1989 book, Talking Back, she writes, and since I'm older now than when I was in college, I need these. Moving from silence into speech is for the oppressed, the colonized, the exploited. And for those who stand and struggle side by side, a gesture of defiance that heals, that makes new life and new growth possible. That makes new life and new growth possible. It is an act of speech, of talking back. It is no mere gesture of empty words, but that is the expression of our movement from object to subject. The expression of our movement from object to subject, the liberated voice. This book is just that. It is an act of talking back. It is a movement from object to subject. It is the liberated voice of young people who will lead us into the future. And with that, let me turn the microphone over to Professor Entin and Professor Theoharis, who will lead us in today's conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Oh, are we using this? Do I have to use this?
We can hear you. The microphone on the podium?
On the podium.
Picking you up.
Oh, perfect. Good. But I can't walk then. Okay. Thank you so much for coming and celebrating Until We're Seen. I think today feels like almost an unimaginable day from where this project began. Like when the idea for this project started, actually in a conversation that Dominic Braswell and I had, because the Social Science Research Council had announced rapid response grants to researchers studying the inequality in the COVID-19 pandemic the first spring, in spring of 2020. And at the same time, as a faculty person here at Brooklyn College, the economic needs of our community were like nothing I had ever seen. And so I decided to email the head of the SSRC, Alejandra Nelson, and there would have been no book without Alejandra Nelson, to ask if we could actually put a grant forward to have student researchers write about and document the impacts of the pandemic on their communities around Brooklyn. Because one of the things that this grant was asking researchers to do was to do quick research that did not require IRB. And all of you in the room know that if you don't get IRB approval, you're not going to have very many voices in that research. And so we asked her, and that summer, the SSRC gave us a small grant, and we had our first cohort of students. And it was beyond anything I think Joseph and I and Dominic had ever imagined in terms of the power of what people were documenting. And all 18 students wrote narratives, and they were deposited at the Center for Brooklyn History and in Brooklyn College's COVID archives, but we decided it was not enough and that these needed to be made public. And so the award-winning blog, Black Perspectives, agreed to publish 8 of those pieces in the fall. And so it became bigger. And out of that, Brooklyn College said, we will fund you to do another cohort in January. And then out of that, we got an email from the University of Pennsylvania Press series editor, Alma Gottlieb, saying, are you thinking about a book? And not in our wildest dreams had we thought about a book, because I think all of you in here know, as well as we do, that we had never seen a university press publish undergraduate student research. But they said they were interested. And out of that, we got the Mellon Foundation to give us money to do a third cohort in the summer of 2021. And then meanwhile, my best friend who teaches at Cal State LA was seeing what we were doing, and she started to do a project with her students at Cal State LA. And out of that came this, which includes 16 of those powerful narratives from those 3 cohorts of Brooklyn College students, 4 narratives from the Cal State LA students, and responses by 4 faculty from Brooklyn College and 1 from Cal State LA. So again, it is incredible to be here today. It is beyond anything. This project has just gone beyond anything, but I think it speaks to the power of what these students, these young people, these incredible researchers did in terms of making us see things that maybe we weren't comfortable with seeing, but need to see. So let me turn it over to you to talk about what the pieces do.
Okay. Thanks everybody for being here. It's so amazing to see all of you, and especially to see our contributors who are here today. I want to thank everybody at the college, at the Mellon Foundation, at SSRC, and beyond who have supported this project. I, among other things, am a scholar of working class literature. And the best narratives, invariably, of literature and labor tell stories not only of work and life on the job, but work far beyond it, what Karl Marx called living labor, the lives that workers live, the ways that they resist, that they persist, the ways they find joy, and the full, rich lives that they lead. And this is the case in Until We're Seen. These are not single-issue stories, but complex, multifaceted chronicles of multiracial, working-class life, power, and brilliance. And you'll get to hear some of those stories here today. The second thing and last thing I really want to say is that these stories are a testament to the power of CUNY students. You know, all of us who teach at CUNY are here because of them. Their smarts, their perspective, their commitments, and nothing in my career has made me prouder and has inspired me more than the work that these students have put into this project and the way they have gone about it with keen intelligence and incredible courage and bravery to write these pieces about often painful things and tell them with incredible honesty and frankly style is incredible. And I just, as Jeanne says, we are just overawed with what you've done. CUNY students, these students have knowledge that the world needs. And they deserve the best, a fully funded university, bright, clean classrooms, more full-time faculty, support for their learning, but also for their lives and their families, for the full complexity that they bring to the world and the university. That is what they deserve. I'm so excited that you are all here, that we can hear from these students a little bit about what they have written. So thank you. I think the way we're going to proceed is we're going to have, I think there are 9 student contributors, and we'll ask you all to come up. And maybe you could just introduce yourself briefly and talk for roughly 3 minutes about your piece and what you think it tells us. And then we'll ask the faculty contributors to come up and say a quick word. Does that seem good?
Yep. And
okay.
Dominic, maybe you could start.
Yeah, maybe we'll start with Dominic Braswell.
I don't have a presentation. I just put my notes on my laptop. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Dominic Braswell. I wrote the 13th chapter of this incredible book. The chapter is titled Living in the Projects, COVID-19 and Community Resilience. And the inspiration behind the piece, was that during the pandemic, public housing was thrusted back into the local media spotlight. Here in New York City, there was a lot of dialogue, and rightfully so, about the particular unique risks faced by NYCHA residents of hospitalization and death from the COVID-19 virus, being that NYCHA is home to 2 populations that were at heightened vulnerability during the pandemic, that of low-income families and the elderly. And so while there was these news stories about at-risk NYCHA complexes, what was missing from the coverage was the voices of public housing residents, as well as a more detailed and concrete account of our experiences during the pandemic. And so this absence kind of sparked the idea behind the piece. And I framed my chapter around community, and how the pandemic disrupted how we at Crown Heights' Albany houses build and are in community with one another. It was important for me to frame it through this lens because, the 50-plus years of public discourse about life in public housing, coming from the media, elected officials, as well as some scholars, has left the general public with an image of the projects that are more like dystopian war zones than actual communities of people who care about each other's well-being. And so I try to challenge this illustration. My piece also pushes back against narratives linking the issues plaguing public housing to the behavior of residents. I argue it is those of us who call the projects home, who are at the forefront to push for remedies and to improve conditions of buildings. And that the true blame for the dilapidated and blighted conditions of complexes lie at the feet of local housing authorities, state and federal officials who for decades have neglected and underfunded public housing communities like NYCHA. Lastly, I write about how this unfortunate neglect creates the necessity for us to adopt mutual aid practices in an attempt to fill the void the government and NYCHA should be. And during this pandemic, this culture of mutual aid would be tapped into with some obstacles that arise for us. And so, please, get your hands on this book if you haven't already. I'm so proud to have been a part of this amazing text, and it is many things, but I think most importantly, this book is it's an archive of the pandemic, written and framed from the perspective of students, from the most deeply impacted communities, during the pandemic. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Tanya. I wrote chapter 3. It's called Double Jeopardy. I'm not as prepared as Dominic, but I can talk a little bit about the inspiration of what I wrote. I'm from Brooklyn. I grew up not too far from here. I'm from Little Haiti. And I just talked about the real realities of Caribbean essential workers in New York City and not being able to have the option to not work. I talked from the perspective of my parents. My mom is a home health aide, and my dad is a New York City's public driver. He is a school bus driver. And I just talked about how the pandemic was specifically drastic for the Caribbean community in New York City because not only do they take care of their homes, like their families, but they have families back at home who depend on them. And the ability to not work was just not an option. And the ability to work from home also wasn't an option. It's not only stressing about your family here in America, but your family back home as well. And I think a lot of what I wrote was kind of expressing like the culmination of like inequalities in New York City that made the COVID pandemic even more drastic for certain communities. I talked about pre-existing health conditions, about not having access to primary doctors. I talked about, deportation still happening even in the midst of a pandemic and how it was negatively affecting Haitian and African immigrants in New York City. And just the frustration with that. My piece wasn't so much as emotional as I've read other people who wrote in the book. It was more kind of raw and real because you're living it at the time, and it's hard to be vulnerable in a time where this is my real reality. So it's kind of just, my piece was kind of just putting the evidence in front of people and being like, this is what's happening in our communities and there's no escaping it, Not only does it affect you, but it affects your family back home. And yeah, that's it.
Hello, my name is Jamila Powell. I wrote chapter 4, Beloved but Forced to Live and Die in the Shadows. And I wrote about a father figure in my life that died pretty early on in the pandemic. He died in April of that year, and he was someone that was undocumented. And in my piece, I kind of pieced together a bit of his life and maybe some of the things that he was thinking, possibly hesitating on receiving medical attention because he was undocumented. And this was all pieced together through the narrative of my grandmother. She told me a little bit more about who he was and his past. He was someone that he was very reserved and he didn't like to really speak about his past. So he was someone that was born in Mexico, and he was abandoned by his parents. He came to the U.S. in the 80s. He crossed the border in the 80s via foot. And I connect his story to the struggles that a lot of undocumented people went through in the pandemic. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaja Welge, and I wrote Chapter 19, Pandemic Deepens Food Inequality in Bed-Stuy in particular. I wanted to highlight the way in which Black communities and Latinx communities have no choice but to rely and be dependent on each other during the pandemic, and just in general. The city was flat out lying about giving us mutual aid, about giving us funding. That was all lies. And I wanted to highlight the community workers in our neighborhood and the people that look like us that are actually doing the work. I feel more than often, well, not more than often, historically, Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities are deemed as sacrifice zones in America and within the global South. And we have no choice, as I mentioned, but to rely on each other. And as we venture into, not venture, but like we already in late stage capitalism, it's becoming overly reliant and overly like that we have no choice but to rely on each other. And I just wanted to really just, you know, keep it honest about the fact that the city is not helping, and we have no choice but to rely on our community partners that's growing the vegetables, that's growing the fruits, that's going to go and give the dinners to the older people within our community. That's if you can't do your nails or you can't do your hair, you know you could go down the block to your friend that do hair and nails, even though it's the pandemic. I mean, but beauty is still in play. But yeah, and I feel like it's important that we realize that we really all we got in each other, and the city doesn't necessarily care. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Marcia Decadus, and I wrote chapter 14 of in the novel, in the book. I wanted to start off with a quote from my old professor. He said, "Tell me where you live, and I'll tell you about your health." And at the time, while I thought it was interesting, I wasn't sure if it was necessarily true. Up until that point, I was a biology major, and I was very focused on the biologic agent of disease. But as I took more courses in sociology and policy and more public health courses, I learned that not only are his words true, but residents coupled with race can help determine health outcomes. And COVID-19 was no exception. I have a few data points. Dr. Malika Fair of the American Association of Medical Colleges stated that COVID-19 death rates were 6 times higher in areas that were predominantly non-white as compared to areas that were predominantly white. In the nation's capital, Black residents represented less than half the population, but nearly 80% of COVID-19 related deaths. And Latinx populations had the highest per capita infection rates throughout the city. And while news outlets identified pre-existing conditions such as hypertension and diabetes as the reasons why these communities were more at risk of COVID-19 infection rates and mortality rates, very little was done to understand the structural pieces that put these populations at risk to begin with. So I set out to do just that and learned that discriminatory lending practices established nearly 100 years ago designed white and Black communities with different living conditions that would predispose Black and brown communities to worse health outcomes. And this was not an easy undertaking. I must have quit every night and went back to work every morning with encouragement through Professor Granville, Professors Entin, and Professor Theoharis. But I hoped that anyone who read this was left moved. If you understood that neighborhood composition affected neighborhood amenities, I hope you felt seen. And for those who didn't know there was a correlation between the two, I hope they learned something. But most importantly, I just wanted anyone to read this to know that they could make a difference. And I feel like it's easier to kind of dismantle something when the spotlight is put on the issue. So thank you. That was all I set out to do. And I thank you all so much for the opportunity to be able to do so. Thank you.
Oh, it's one. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raul Vega. I wrote chapter 7 from Ahuehuetitla to Brooklyn. Life under, I forget what it was. I'll let it go. I forgot. I'll tell you exactly what I was trying to highlight in the chapter. I was trying to highlight the experiences of immigrant families during the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on the hardships and inequalities they faced, particularly in terms of healthcare, work, and government policies like the public charge rule. What I wanted you to see differently and understand differently was how deeply rooted systemic inequalities affect immigrant communities, especially during crises. They seek to show that while immigrant labor is essential, these individuals are often left without the support and recognition they deserve, pushing you, the readers, to see that the injustice in the treatment of immigrants in America. So what was a little tricky about this was talking about the public charge rule. So the public charge rule, just to clearly define it, is a rule that allows the U.S. government to deny visas or green cards to immigrants deemed likely to depend on public benefits like Medicaid and food stamps. Now, why is this difficult to understand? It's difficult to understand because the term public charge is vague and has been inconsistently defined over time. This vagueness makes it easy for each administration to interpret and manipulate the rule based on its political agenda. For instance, under the Trump administration, it expanded its scope, penalizing immigrants for using more public benefits, while other administrations like Biden's have worked to reverse or limit its impact. I'll leave it at that. It was very difficult to write about this chapter. It was emotionally taxing, and it was overall exhausting, but it felt beautiful to be in community with like-minded people who were interrogating the structural systemic oppression that happens in this country. So thank you for having me, Professor Entin, Theoharis, and Dominic, and everyone else.
Hi, my name is Genesis Urrea. I wrote chapter 17, Everybody's Gotta Eat. It's something my dad says. What I really wanted to do, and in naming my chapter that, is just the reality of being human. You have to eat to sustain life. And I think the pandemic did a really great job of highlighting who doesn't get to sustain life, and particularly in this city. And I wanted to highlight those who have always existed, so particularly immigrants and particularly undocumented immigrants. The unsung heroes who had to rely on the label of heroes during this pandemic with no compensation, either financially or personally, to their person, to their family, to our communities. I also wanted to use my own personal story to really bring forth the reality of what doesn't really make my story different from those who lived during this pandemic, and it's the fact that we're all human. My family suffered just as much as millions of other families during this pandemic. We had to face the cruel reality of mortality and the fact that it is so disposable, and the humanity and pain that are intrinsic to living and living through a pandemic that would fundamentally change our lives. My piece speaks to the population of people that have been used and abused for the sake of capitalism, and the pandemic brought to light the disposability of people, and particularly undocumented immigrants, since they're mostly unseen and particularly want to be seen, not seen, but are used to be unseen. I wanted to write about my community, the people who have raised me, the beliefs and villages that led me to pursue law today. I wanted to share the vulnerability of my life and how it exists and the reality of systems that shape global disasters like the pandemic as a no-fault consequence or coincidence. My community, alongside many of these beautiful and wonderful writers here today in their own communities, live in our reliance of each other and our resilience of our communities that fostered the spirit that led us here today. And what I really wanted when writing my piece was for it to really highlight the fragility of humanity and the fact that it is treated more so just as disposable. And living in the city, living during this pandemic, really highlighted of who is disposable. And I was working at a nonprofit organization here in Brooklyn, and I got to really see, quite tragically, people die in parks, because where else would they die? And I have been so honored to write alongside these wonderful writers and professors who helped foster this project. And I'm incredibly thankful for this opportunity.
What's up? All right. So I was originally I had been taking a class with Professor Alonso, who recommended me for this autoethnography thing. I didn't really, which was good timing or whatever, just because right around that time I had been working at Amazon, which I'd been doing through the whole first year of the pandemic. I was like a DSP driver, so I was doing last mile, like dropping shit off of people's homes. So that was like really weird, just because being in that position, there's like a lot of contrast in that situation, because on the one hand, you know, we're outside all day, but obviously the thing to do is not be outside at all. So it was like a weird contrast. And then it was compounded by the fact that by the nature of the Amazon business model is like you're actually going outside all day laboring to deliver people like bullshit, right? Like it's not, most of it's actually not even important. So it kind of reinforces this sense that it's like I'm literally risking my life for people to get, you know, napkins or, you know what I'm saying? Like whatever nonsense that people are delivering through Amazon. So I came out of there feeling a certain type of way. I feel like I had like a story. So when this opportunity came along, it was like, hey, do you have a story about being marginalized during the pandemic? I was like, yes, I do. So yada, 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 we got into this whole process, which has been very cool. And I also want to just stop and take a second here to thank Professors Theoharis and Entin, and Professor Aha, and Professor Alonso, and Dominic, and all of the other people that contributed to this, because it's super cool. So yeah, I guess specifically to talk about my piece, which is called Prolific, which, yes, is a pretty cool piece of wordplay, if I don't, you know, yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's called Prolific, and basically, like, I guess probably one of the most, what I would just want to talk about would just be the, like, I had this sense of, like, I just wanted to, like, you know, I got a gripe, you know, so it's like, and here's a place for me to, here's an outlet for that gripe. So that kind of was taken care of, like, relatively early in the process of putting together the piece. So I had done my, you know, my histrionic, like, I feel bad about this. And I wrote it, but then it became more about the context and the historical context of this experience and sourcing it and everything. And so then it just kind of became more about, an individual dealing with this like very intense product with, Amazon on your back and this whole, it's just, it's really, Amazon's really powerful and like really bad. So, it was a lot to work through and write it, but I definitely feel like it was valid, and I think it's a really important thing to contribute to the historical narrative in terms of what it was just like to be in that position and really feel like acutely like you work for the biggest, most powerful, like kind of capitalistic retail entity in the world, and they don't give a shit whether you live or die. That was pretty much it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Alejandra. I wrote chapter 11 in this wonderful book that tells so many important stories, and to actually see the authors in person and hear it from their mouth really galvanizes the importance of what it means to be living during this time and to be on the fringes of society. And I work in a service. I'm a lieutenant with FDNY EMS. I've been there 20 years. I'm also the vice president of Local 3621, the EMS Officers Union. And I oversee about 4,000 members. And we, historically, we being EMS, have not been treated fairly compared to the other 911 services. We're paid $50,000 less. We don't get the same pay and benefits. To give you just a brief example, when we die in the line of duty, our families get 3 years pay. When a firefighter, a cop, or even a sanitation worker dies in the line of duty, their families get pay and benefits for life. So during the pandemic, I lost 10 people to COVID. And they got 3 years pay, and a top pay EMT is about $50,000. So their families for the rest of their lives have $150,000 to kind of break up and try and make it work with their kids and wives and husbands. And there's a context to that is I'm the most diverse 911 service. EMS, as it currently is constituted, is 60% minority. It's almost 40% female. I have everything under the sun working alongside of me, and that's what I love about it. And for years, I've gone into your homes, and I've seen the marginalized communities and the people who don't have access and who tell me, I don't have insurance. I can't go to the hospital because I can't afford to pay for it. And so I give them extra medicine to keep at home. Or I change some of their information so they don't get a bill. I could be fired for that. But I sit there and I empathize because that was me. I was homeless for 2 years. I know what it's like. Somebody mentioned the Albany houses. I worked 10 years of my career going in and out of the Albany houses, treating people. And so to be a part of this, I wanted to highlight that America's healthcare system needs 911, but not the 911 as we like it, as we see it today. Don't call 911 now. At the moment, 75%, roughly 75% of my workforce has less than 5 years experience. I've had 12 members commit suicide since March of 2020. I've always been high in suicides, but it's gone over, it's tipped over. And the shame of it is EMS is a genuinely beautiful job. I'm not there to arrest you. I'm not there to break things. I'm there just to help. It's the ultimate confessional. I have the ultimate backstage pass. You will tell me things that you won't tell your family. And then I sit there and treat you without judgment, without care, where you're from, what color, what sexuality. It really is, in its essence, a wonderful job, and people don't value it yet. And going through the pandemic, the most vulnerable of the 911 services, treating the most vulnerable of the communities, and feeling as they were banging their pots and pans for us. Remember that, everybody was out there. And that was nice. And in the city's darkest moments, what lit the way was the lights from the sirens and the ambulances. Those were the ambulances you heard. We provided hope for people. And since the pandemic is over, we have been left out to hang. Mayor Adams has refused to give us pay parity. The city has forgotten us. and we no longer are able to maintain. And so what this does, and I want to thank the professors that were named, obviously, for letting me be a part of such a wonderful community of writers. But what it does is it reminds me that there's a lot of work to do, and we are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody's going to save us. We're the ones we've been waiting for. So it's up to us to change this, because it has to change. It can't go on like this. This is not what life is. I've been to over 120 countries, and let me tell you, this is not what life has to be. It can be a beautiful thing in community and spirituality and togetherness. And we are together, right? This proves it here. So if we're ever feeling down, remember this moment. We're together. All right, thank you.
Just going to take a minute after that beautiful, Thank you, Anthony, for saying that. So my name is Alejandra Marchevsky, and I come to you from Los Angeles, California, representing the group of students and myself who worked on a section of the book called Gender, Sexuality, and Inequality in Los Angeles and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I am so grateful and excited to be here to share space with you all, to get to meet so many of the contributors to the book. I feel like I've lived with you in my mind for, 2 years now, as we've been writing and editing together and occasionally coming together over Zoom. And really to be in kind of a cross-continental, cross-coastal dialogue, right, about the tremendous injustices and horrors and tragedies that our communities on both coasts and every community in between have experienced since 2020. I want to thank the editors of the book, Joseph Entin and Jeanne Theoharis, and Gaston Alonso and the Wolf Institute for inviting me here. As Jeanne explained, she and I are really good friends. We've been besties since grad school. And so when I found out about the project that she was doing here at Brooklyn College, and got to, she was sharing some of the pieces with me, and then I got to see a few of them published in Black Perspectives online, a light bulb went off. And I said, this sounds incredibly like what we're living in Los Angeles. These sound like my student voices from Cal State LA. And so I took the opportunity to start to offer a pandemic autoethnography assignment in my classes. And so over a period of about a year and a half, we collected dozens of student narratives from my classes as well. When the book proposal came through and there was an opportunity to publish this as an edited volume, Joseph and Jeanne generously invited the Cal State LA team to be part of a section of the book, and that's where we are. And so I wanna kind of lift up what Kaja mentioned in terms of the ways that our world is now structured around sacrifice zones. That's something that I write about in my chapter that sort of responds to the 4 student essays from Cal State LA. And in particular, because Cal State LA sits in the heart of Mexican Latinx Los Angeles, our campus is about 80% students of Latin American ancestry, the vast majority of whom are either from Mexico or Central America. I really delve in my chapter in kind of looking at the ways that Latinx residents of Los Angeles were viewed as disposable bodies, right, as workers largely undocumented, documented, who were going to be sacrificed for the survival of the city, and particularly the survival of the west side of the city, which is disproportionately white and wealthy. A few thoughts to share. The first is that when the pandemic first hit, I have this very vivid memory of kind of sitting at home and watching the coverage of New York, the stories of the sirens, the ambulances, and thinking, this is just going to be New York, right? New York is so different from the rest of the United States. You have, crowded subways, you have tall buildings. We're not going to get this in LA. As we started seeing the pandemic numbers of infections and deaths in LA start to creep up in the summer of 2020 and the fall, and then really explode that following winter, what became really clear is that the pandemic was a story of global inequality, right? Many of the conditions that we had identified as kind of structured racial capitalism, right? The dismantling of the public welfare systems that we associated with global cities like New York and LA, I think really both created conditions, right, for COVID-19 deaths and displacement, all kinds of displacements to occur in global cities like LA and New York. But I think the other thing we came to realize is that the conditions of the global city have now moved even to the smallest towns and villages of the United States and other countries, right? The extreme inequities around access to life and access to death, or, you know, what Ruth Gilmore refers to, you know, racism as people's, kind of access or proximity to untimely early death, right? Is what was kind of unveiled by the COVID-19 pandemic and continues to be true today. The other thing that I think our essays in LA revealed are what happens in communities of color and working class communities when there's a project of organized state abandonment, right? Which is how Joseph and Jeanne describe it in the introduction to the book. And so one of the arguments that I make and that I think the student essays really pull through is that when the state fails to step up to its social responsibilities, it often is women, non-binary folks, and queer folks in those communities and families that kind of step in and have to do the care work, right? They have to be the ones that nurse their family members back to health or figure out how to bury them when they pass away. They have to be the ones to provide the daycare, to go to work and then work the double or triple shift to be able to cover the running of the household, right? To take care of elders in the community. And we really see that, I think, coming through in the essays that the Cal State LA students wrote. So we have Wen Casillas writing about taking care, being a home healthcare worker who's paid by the state, exploited by the state actually, to take care of their aging grandfather who has Alzheimer's disease. We have Elizabeth de Leon writing about being a mom to a pre-K student and having to help all the Latina immigrant mothers in her school community even be able to figure out how to get access to the internet, right? And get the crappy computers that the school handed out to families to work. We have Maria Cerezo writing about her father's, who is a undocumented construction worker, dying from COVID-19 and then doing this kind of social forensic analysis to figure out why the deaths of construction workers were so much higher than in other industries, right? And then unraveling all of this kind of long-term toxic contamination of construction sites and the lack of PPE in that industry. And then finally, Manny Ibarra's essay on what it means to be an undocuqueer student, kind of shuttered in at home, and a reflection that I heard from a lot of students, actually, that Manny puts into words so powerfully, which is what happens when you're a feminist student, a queer student, where you find safety on campus and kind of an escape from the kind of gender expectations at home, expectations that you're always available to do the dishes, to do childcare, or having to repress your identity, your gender identity, or your sexual identity at home. Campus spaces become such important refuges for our students. And so Manny really looks at like what happened to queer students, right? And in this case, undocumented queer students, non-binary queer students, when you're trapped at home, right, with family members who don't honor, right, all of the beauty in your diverse gender and sexual identities. So I hope that you'll check out their essays. I'm so proud to have worked with them and to be part of this project. And maybe
hello, everybody. My name is Lawrence Johnson, and I wrote Chapter 20, which is a commentary on the section Community Organizing, Mutual Aid, and Struggle. And I'm the newest comer to this project. I was called in maybe in the last minute, so I missed the opportunity to hear about all the projects that they were developing and things like that. But I feel like I've had enough time to really put this book in context. And I think what this book does is to remind us that the revolution in higher education is incomplete. If we really think about the 1960s and the call for Black studies and every area studies that followed, it was to actually produce these type of stories that actually inform the reality of what we're dealing with in our society. So the revolution is incomplete, but I think this book and more books like this will push us closer to the reality that when students come to Brooklyn College, they occupy a hostile environment, sometimes as hostile as their neighborhoods, right? I started my section with James Baldwin because I want to deal with the fact that when you come to Brooklyn College campus, or most campuses, you cannot be your whole self. You cannot tell the basic truths of the lives in your family, in your neighborhood, and stuff like that. So when Genesis talks about her father and everybody has to eat, or she tells the story of Oscar, she's telling stories that you have no space to talk about in your classroom because you have a curriculum. And that curriculum, even if it's radical, wants to deal with the proletariat in 1843 France, 1848 France, and not the people who are starving, facing life and death situations right here in Sunset Park. So when we talk about this idea of a revolution in higher education, we're actually talking about real people in Brooklyn on this campus every day. And if we begin to tell those stories, we change the institution. If we say, let's forego maybe the tired curriculum, the tired standards, the pedagogy that we're comfortable with as professors, and actually listen to our students, really listen. When they say that my community has to survive on each other because the state abandoned us, that means they started gardening at Kaja's church, because if they didn't do it, people in the neighborhood don't eat. And in the process of gardening, they're talking politics and the realities of their lives that will probably be far more expansive and political educational value than anything that we might hear and learn in our classrooms, right? Bed-Stuy is just a few miles away from Brooklyn College, Flatbush even closer, and if we really start talking about these stories, we can transform much of what we think about higher education and what our duties are as faculty members. We just have to talk to the people in the community. I think that's the point of these stories. We talk about gentrification all the time in academia. If you go to Bed-Stuy, the conversation about what's happening there, where a community goes from 90+% Black to almost less than 40% Black, they're not calling it gentrification. It's ethnic cleansing, and that's the common sense. The person who may not have the degree, who may not have the PhD, could tell you that gentrification is far too nice of a term. When people are priced out, it's not just them being priced out, can't pay their bills or their mortgage or their rent. They're getting their deeds stolen, and when white people move in, they're moving in with a larger police presence. More people are getting arrested, and people are getting displaced, and those displaced people aren't going off to Pennsylvania all the time. Sometimes they're literally right here on the street. That's another form of violence that you have to see, and everything becomes a conversation of how do we make our Bed-Stuy more beautiful, right? So that's what Kaja was talking about. That's what Adia was talking about. And Daniel Vasquez was one of the most politically active students during the pandemic. He talked about his sister and them sewing face masks and everything else, but he was talking about the hostility at Brooklyn College as well. So the very fact that Daniel was somebody who they were trying to get to graduate early because he was becoming such a problem for the institution tells us very much that the revolution is incomplete. And when we really think about books like these, we know that we have a duty as faculty and administration to say, we need to let our students speak and not be afraid of what they have to say, because what they have to say will actually make us a better institution, and make us better faculty, and make us a better cadre of staff, administrators, and everything else. So the main point of this is that there is nothing outside of our lives that's not political. So when students come into the classroom, their politics have to be welcome. We cannot tell them that this is the subject of the course, because almost every subject of any course is related to the politics of students' everyday lives. And if we do not honor that, if we don't listen to it, and if we don't challenge ourselves to meet and address that, then we're doing a disservice in our job as faculty.
I didn't want to talk after Lawrence. I didn't really want to talk after the students either. What amazing contributions from everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Ria Rahman. I teach in anthropology here. I responded to the section of chapters entitled Racism, Family, and Commitments in a Time of Emergency. My piece was called Black Lives Matter, COVID, Race, and Organized Abandonment. I do want to follow and just set my timer as was suggested. I was really honored to be asked to respond to these student pieces. The politics and ethics of the project really align with my own as a teacher, as a scholar, and just as a human being. I teach anthropology, and I often talk about, if anthropology is supposed to be the study of humanity, how do all of these institutions and the logics that ground them, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, Islamophobia, racial capitalism, how do these logics actually get in the way of us actually being able to hold each other in our full humanity and able to hold ourselves in our full humanity and to hold others. And that's my greatest aim with, as building off what Lawrence Johnson was just talking about, of, when I teach anthropology, I tell my students, I don't care about you understanding the discipline for on its own terms or what it means for itself, but how can we use the methods or concepts of this discipline to understand ourselves. And as Donna Granville mentioned, right, building off bell hooks, I see from where I stand, right? So how do we understand ourselves and the world from that particular vantage point? When I teach anthropology, and I'm teaching a course right now in ethnography, and actually, even in my intro classes, I've been teaching sections from this book in my classes to talk about autoethnography, right? And I think it's really inspiring for my students to know that these are their colleagues, right? That I wanted a quote from one of the pieces I responded to from Billy Ray Johnson, writes this beautiful poem, and she says, "Growing up in the ghetto gave me a bird's eye view of inequality." And I think that really beautifully encapsulates the radical potential and the radical potential of autoethnography, right? To understand ourselves from this perspective. I talk to my students about intersectionality, but then when we have these pieces in front of us to say, okay, how did this person, where they're growing up? Raul, one of your pieces, you have the immunocompromised neighborhoods, right? How does what we eat and our health is based on where we come, and what kind of access do we have to medicines, to vaccines, et cetera. And to have that, it's one thing to read Kimberly Crenshaw and read out intersectionality, but another to understand the lived experience of these concepts, right? If at best we just give a language, our students already know. Again, I appreciate how Lawrence put it in his piece. What I aim to do is to emphasize our students already know. Right? And if best, we can just give language for situating these lived experiences, to treat our students as knowers and not as deficient learners. That's really all I try to do in the classroom as well. And I think this project really beautifully brings that to light with all of these pieces. So thank you so much to the editors, Joseph Entin and Jeanne Theoharis and Dominic Braswell, and all of the student authors. I've learned so much from you, and thank you so much for contributing and really investigating your own experiences. I tried to do that as well. I was just talking before of I also tried to investigate my own experience and it's scary and it's vulnerable, and also I think it's the most honest. And so thank you all for doing that. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Granville, and I teach here in sociology. And I'm just going to take a moment because as I sat here, I've just been getting very emotional. I am back to the place where I was when I was writing this book with this chapter, and I'm feeling some feelings. I'm going to try to keep it brief and sort of push through and keep it clear what I'd like to say. My chapter is chapter 15, and it's titled We See From Where We Stand, COVID-19 in the Shape of Us. And I was responding to Anthony, Ariba, Dominic, Marcia, and essentially crises of health and housing. And I want to acknowledge, because as I read this chapter, what I acknowledged was those circumstances have worsened. They've worsened. And so I'm back to the central question that I was interrogating, which is, what good is what I teach if I'm helping students acknowledge the material conditions they exist in, but I'm not also spending time about what the path to liberation is? And I'll be very clear, it makes me uncomfortable, right? I'm an immigrant, and I feel like what my family's dream was for me to achieve this American dream, and yet and still I realize it's very tenuous. It's not actually something that I can hold on to. Right? And so I've had to interrogate, what am I doing in the classroom, which is a space I feel the most like an activist, right? And so I appreciate these texts because they pushed me, right? I'm very clear on wanting students to tell their stories and creating space for that, but is it enough if we're not also spending adequate and more time on what does the world look like that we want to realize? Right? So I'm gearing up to teach Intro to Soc, and that's what's in my mind. I can't go back in without reading these texts and having us interrogate this, but also spend time thinking about what the value of this institution is here, right? If we're here and we get to think about these things, and I always consider the fact that there's only one generation between me and a family member who was told that they couldn't go to school, that they couldn't learn. And now I get to learn and to think and to essentially be a part of the consciousness raising work that we need so we can create the seeds for the revolution that we're looking for, right? And again, I say this, that there's discomfort here, but I say to students, we push through our discomfort because that's where the learning is, right? We push through the idea that we have to find a right answer, right? Because in getting it wrong, we still learn what we're looking for and how we can realize that. And so I really do hope everyone gets a chance to read the text and to interrogate and to think about where they stand and what they see from where they stand, and to acknowledge that in the multiplicity of perspectives is where we find the actual path to liberation. Right, in valuing these different perspectives and recognizing that the problem is actually, right, it's dense and it's complex, but what we bring offers us the true path to liberation. And I'm even more committed after coming back to this text to making sure that what I do here is about spending more time on what the path to liberation looks like and how we push through the discomfort to make it something real that's in this lifetime and not the next. Thank you, guys.
Saludos, everybody. Nice to see you all. I'm Alan Aja. I have the honor of co-chairing or sort of co-running the Mellon Transfer Student Research Program with Professor Theoharis and Professor Entin. I also chair PEARL, Puerto Rican Latinx Studies Department. So one of the reasons why I was late is because I was actually at a chair's lunch. Chair spaces where chairs help set agendas and so forth with our administration and so forth. And one of the things that I started off actually in the book was the fact that I was in the at the early stages of the pandemic. I was in a very chair's lunch when the New York Times and publications were promoting this kind of narrative that a pandemic, right, the pandemics will affect the economy, they will affect CUNY, and therefore some of us are going to have to go, as in programs, as in departments, right? And there was a quiet, some of my own colleagues were saying things out loud about these sort of kinds of impacts. And at the beginning of the chapter, which I called When Essential Student Workers Strike Back, I say that I have a union organizing background, I'm active in our union here, but I also love the ways in which that, you don't necessarily, I see Anthony, I'm seeing like inspired by the Trader Joe's workers to the nurses, right, to Amazon and so forth. That was embedded in here. But there are also ways that you don't necessarily have to be in a union, and the writers show that here, to strike back. Or to strike, to use that kind of analogy. So I was inspired sort of by the ways in which those strikes were happening at everyday sort of intergroup, right, to cooperative, to mutual aid societies. It was already mentioned about Daniel. His sister was creating the mass when the government had failed us, right? When those masks should have been at our doors. Right? So, as you said, it's like we are the ones we've been waiting for, right? Or I'm inspired by the quote by a Brazilian LGBTQ plus activist in the 1970s. It's like they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And the seeds are here. And so one of the things I tried to focus on here, it isn't just about sort of essential workers, because that, and some of you, Zaid, I believe, and Kayla pushed back on those terms, right? And sort of said, essential, what the hell? All work is essential, right? Especially in a capitalist economy, right? But one of the things I wanted to do, I remember reading the New York Times, and they were talking about essential work, and they didn't mention freaking CUNY students, right? And how many, and one of the things in the introduction that you'll read is how many students across the country are in those positions while they're getting their fucking education, excuse my language, right? Sorry, I'm moved by this, all right? And so one of the things I connected sort of my own colleagues pushing, right, and saying things are going to happen because that's what economics predicts, neoliberal models predicts. But the student writers here were saying that's not going to happen. Right? And we're going to push back in our own ways through organizing, through autonomous movements, whether they're informal through unions or they're informal unions of solidarity. So I'm inspired and I'm honored to have, played a very small role here in learning from Samantha and from Zaid and from Tanya and from Yamilka and Kayla and Danielle. And if I haven't mentioned you, I apologize. But thank you for your work and thank you for inspiring us. Saludos.
I think that will move to Q&A. So if you have questions, if you have comments, thank you for sharing that. I realize how many of you have been my students and how incredibly proud I am of you. So I'm going to cry again. So before I cry again, comments or questions, and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Okay. Hi. It's a very simple question. So I'm kind of like new to like involving myself. I just want to say you guys did a really good job, and this is like a really important thing. How would students who are like new to hearing this find out about more opportunities like this? And also, where is this book accessible?
So a couple of things. The book was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. So you can buy it, but it's also available as a free electronic copy through the CUNY library. So you can read it without having to buy it. If you do want to buy it, you can get it from Amazon, you can get it from your local bookstore, you can order it from the University of Pennsylvania Press. So that's very exciting. But CUNY has an electronic copy, which means that everybody in this room doesn't have to buy it and can read it, can go online tonight. And so one of the things that we were so grateful for the Wolf doing this beautiful like backdrop tonight, it's like you get to just see what the book looks like, but also you can just take a picture and then use your Brooklyn College library card to be able to read it. And we were very grateful to the Brooklyn College Library. They got the electronic copy immediately. So that's how you read it. And here is what it looks like. But I think the bigger question is the kind of going forward, how do we, and I think Lawrence said it, right? Like, how do we keep this kind of project going and this kind of writing? And I think it's happening in various places around the college. As Alan mentioned, Joseph Allen and I run the Mellon Transfer Student Research Program. So if you are a transfer student, one way to kind of get to do independent research with a faculty member, that is one opportunity to do this kind of work. If you're not a transfer student, you can do an independent study with a professor in any department and say, I want to do work that connects an experience that I'm having or my community's having with kind of getting the research, like to kind of be able to lift it up. And I think there are many, many faculty, not just the ones in the book, although the ones in the book are superb, and so you could go to them, who would do those kinds of independent research. And for the Brooklyn College students in the room, one of the most important experiences of my undergraduate life was doing an independent study. So I think one way to get to do this kind of writing, and writing as kind of truth-telling and as pushing back, is like doing it like as an independent study or with some other students with a professor. Because I think there are many people, and again, Alan Aha, Lawrence Johnson, Ria Rahman, Donna Granville, they are just some of the professors here at Brooklyn College, Gaston Alonso, Joseph and I, right? And we're all in a number of different departments. So there are many professors across the college that are really committed to kind of, in many ways, beginning where we stand, right? And saying this is our portal into kind of thinking about the city we want, the country we want. And so, I mean, we can talk more afterwards.
If you're looking for more, if you're looking for something else outside of this dynamic, DC 37 has programs for workers or for you don't have to be a DC 37 member, where they teach you how to organize, how to get involved in local community boards, how to connect with other people in your community to say, hey, this is what we need for this community. And then they show you how it goes up the chain and how you petition and advocate for the members of whatever you're advocating for with local politicians and other organizations that can provide those things. So that's something that's on the DC 37 website. It's available to almost everybody. And they don't ask for documentation status and stuff like that. It's really open to anybody. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Thank you. My name is Shadiq Williams. I'm the program coordinator for the Black and Latino Male Initiative. I kind of have a little bit of a comment, but also in addition to what you just asked, I would say if like a lot of this is really overwhelming to think about, it's like empowering, but also overwhelming, like where do I start? I would say, especially if you're a part of a student organization, it starts with bringing these conversations to your student organization, to your friends, just like having those conversations when you're in the club room, you're in the student center, you're outside the classroom, just kind of like posing some of these thoughts like, hey, like what have you noticed happening around you? What are some things that we can do that are relatively small and tangible that can eventually expand? Like I know in my experience as a student is being in BLMI, a lot of the conversations that were things that I took away a lot from was just sitting in the office, having a conversation with Professor Johnson or other professors. And the last point I want to make too is also looking for opportunities to find mentors and professors. You don't necessarily have to take their classes, but I encourage you all to take an Africana class, a prose class, a sociology class, and then that could also be a way to kind of break the ice in terms of maybe familiarizing yourself with some of these topics or some of these conversations to maybe make it feel a little bit less overwhelming, and then encourage your friends to do the same. I know these departments are always welcoming students to take their courses, and then last point also being if you are a part of an organization, looking for ways to collaborate between your organization and these departments to help bridge that gap and create that stronger community. So there's a BFS, there's Africana, there's prose, all these areas are always excited and looking forward to looking for opportunities to collaborate with student groups. So if you're on an e-board, go to one of these departments and say, hey, like I attended this talk, I've been reading some of these topics, and I really want to try to find ways to immerse myself and my peers more into this, and I would like some guidance and some mentorship from people who have a little bit more experience navigating this. What's an event that we can do to kind of pull in the student body? So that's what I would personally recommend. That's what you're seeing here. You're seeing a bunch of people who are part of a community that came together and put their pieces together to make something happen. So it really just starts with whatever it is you know you're capable of doing and who's capable of doing it around you.
Hello, everybody. I'm not shy. I'm not shy. This is just like really new to me. My name's Fufu. I'm actually a current student at Brooklyn College. I call her Professor JT. That's what I call her. She actually told us, she gave us an idea to come. This is actually my first open panel. I've never, ever. Yeah, thank you. This is we should party for this. I love this. I'm actually on the women's basketball team here, and I wanted to do something because I feel like basketball is just everything to me, but I wanted to find something, like an outlet, something different other than basketball that I can try and tap into. And for all the writers and everybody that contributed into this book, I think you guys did an amazing job. And it's this is how I'm gonna say it. I feel like it's like different. What's really like drawing my attention here, because I'm not really into books like that, but like this book is eating. No shade. I'm sorry, I had to say it. But like it's like the different point of views of everybody's situation going on in COVID. Like I am from African descent, knowing that, you know, everybody had different problems and they survived and they've made it through, and it made them even stronger. It's just so inspirational to me. I wish I had tears. I wish I could cry. Everybody's having tears. I wish I had those same tears, but it's just like it's so awesome. It's amazing meeting everybody. Thank you. It was nice to meet you, and continue being writing. You know, continue being writers. Is writers what it's called? Writers. You know, storytellers, writers, just continue being amazing people and sharing your story. That's all I have.
Any responses from the authors to that amazing comment?
Period. Definitely. And yes, I like that, Professor JT. I love you, Professor Theoharis, and Professor Entin and Dominic. Shout out to y'all for real for even bringing us all together. Like, this is amazing. When I wrote this, I'm currently getting my master's in environmental policy, and that's why I even learned the term sacrifice zones. I'm not even gonna hold y'all. But I really feel like what we did was really important. I feel like a lot of the work that, when it comes to highlighting the things that we are going through, the city tries to put a muzzle on us, and they don't want us to speak up about the disenfranchisement that this city puts us through. It's almost as if we're not allowed to have a voice and to speak about what's going on. And like I said, the city be lying. Like, they just liars. And I'm happy that we all had community during this time to rely on, and we had each other to, my bad, I don't need this. We had each other to rely on as well, and to know that we formed the community within this group. Yeah. Shout out to us.
Don't look at me. So thank you all. It was really great to hear everyone's stories. And I guess one thing that I'm reflecting on is a couple of years out of grad school and undergrad is that you think that everything changes once you have a degree. You think that financial stability will happen. You think that you can help your family. You think you can help your community, and I think so much of the weight still falls on people who are still going through and still living in that reality despite having a college degree. And for me, like, the space of the university was so transformational. So I guess, like, thinking about now all of you a couple of years out after writing this, after experiencing everything that you did, and after now coming back and reflecting on it, you know, how is writing this, how is experiencing all of this informed how you live your life now, or what you do in terms of work? Basically, like, how are y'all kind of question.
Thank you for that, because I wanted to touch on what people have been mentioning about community and how important it is and how we've changed. And as someone who's also the first person to graduate college in his family, and I did it at 44 years old, so it's never too late. I took Professor JT's class back in 2011. So to be remembered and to have an impact so many years later, and to have somebody come and say, hey, I want you to be a part of this because they saw the progression and that you had determination is important. And the community aspect. In 2021, I was so despondent by what I had seen in the city, in this country, and the amount of death that I had partaken in, and the feeling of helplessness and just bearing witness, and not only with the patients I was treating, but with the community that I represent, and having them all call me and say, hey, Anthony, I'm struggling, the medics and EMTs. At one time, a quarter of my workforce was out with COVID. And in response to what you're saying is, in February 2020, I sat in the bathtub and I was going to kill myself. I had the knife, I had it planned. It was only through the grace of love from people that I had in my life that I remembered I didn't give them the opportunity to hear me out, to talk to me about it. I didn't give Professor Alonso in his class when I was taking it online to hear me out. That brief 45-minute, hour and a half online thing kept me in it, kept me in the game. Because it was a little sense of community that people were working through things and that people here were feeling. And I didn't have to be so numb to it and check out the way I thought I was going to. It's very important to be in each other's lives and to not only bear witness, but to make sure we document what we're witnessing. And I just wanted to share that because I think it touches on what you were asking about staying and graduating and being the first to do something and the pressures and trying to be something for somebody and everyone all the time and forgetting to be you for yourself. And you can get lost in that very easy. Even when writing this, it's very triggering, right? Reading these stories, you know? And I didn't give a second thought to the Amazon worker until one of the Amazon workers came to me and said, "Stay there, I'm sick." And I went, oh man, I'm here treating everybody under the sun. And then going to people's homes where the guy who died in front of his daughter because he couldn't stay home because he was working at the supermarket and he had to do double shifts. You know, you forget that word essential, to me at the time, started to mean expendable, right? Because you're an essential worker. And I was like, well, I always thought I was, but I'm expendable. So it's important what you're saying, to be the first of everything and to be present, but also be present for yourself and make sure you remain part of a larger community. Because when times get tough, that community is going to pull you out. Thank you. And thank you for...
Thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna respond to that question too. Also, just thank you for sharing that. That was some powerful stuff. But yeah, also, I don't know, this doesn't necessarily answer your question, but I do just want to say, because we're talking about the book and everything, and the book is super cool, but before it was a book, we were just doing the program, and that was, how long was that? It was like months, right? How long are we doing that? 3 months?
It was the summer long.
Right. So that experience in and of itself was super raw, because it's everybody kind of had their angle going into that process where it was I want to write about this, I want to write about that, but then we were sharing as everybody was working on it, and so it compounded kind of the impact of it in terms of writing it and contributing to the project, because you were watching all of your peers work through the same process while you were working through it. And so just, it seemed like the looks on people's faces when they're talking about this stuff, and it got emotional and stuff in the Zoom call, and that in and of itself was a very potent sort of experience, because now you're not only drawing on your own experience, but you're drawing on the collective experience of drawing on these individual experiences in the interest of producing a new work. So, I just wanted to make sure that gave some voice to that particular element of the process. To respond to your question, as far as afterwards, or what did we take from it or whatever, I know personally, apologies or whatever, I'm probably more cynical about this whole thing than most, but I know I think I kind of came away from this whole process with a more resolute sense of my personal motivations, right? And just kind of looking at, because again, it's nice to hear about all of these things about, revolution, moving towards some sort of a resolution, and, how are we going to, make this better and improve this and get there or whatever. And it's I'm all for all of that. In the meantime, though, I think this experience has kind of centered me more in a thing of just they don't care. They're not about to care. It's not, I don't see it on the horizon. I don't see them caring coming into the picture here. So, and I'm all about community, and, it's good community, and, leaning on one another and everything. That's great. But I also do think that there is, for me personally, I've discovered a deeper sense of being able to like rely on myself, and the importance of just understanding that it's like, yeah, if the people are there to help you, that's great. We want more of that. But it's like the system, the government, the state, capitalism, whatever, they're the enemy. They're working against us. They're not trying to help us, you know? So it's like, I feel like that has become more crystallized and encapsulated having gone through this process.
We have time for one more question, but before, thank you, Anthony, for remembering that experience of being together and building community, and you're such an important part of that. Now, Anthony's incredibly humble, but he's actually the author of his own personal memoir, Go Riding the Lighting, Year in the Life of a New York City Paramedic, and it is a moving and empowering book, so you may want to check that out as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Monique Ngozi Henry. I'm an all-around Brooklyn College person, as in faculty, alumni, something else, staff member. I do have a day job. So I wanted to mention the listening project. I have had for the last 2 semesters, Joseph has come into my class to explain the listening project and to give my students some information about the project. It's oral history, and people can do interviews which can contribute to that project. I teach Research 1012, English 1012. My course is centered on Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and looking for themes of happiness, actually, in that novel. And the themes of happiness obviously also bring up the antithesis of that, which is what makes us unhappy. What I'm curious about, I read like half of the book last night. I just went online and like, ooh. And so I'm going to introduce it in my class. What I really want to have some sense of for the students is what hooked you on doing the research? What brought you into that space? Because I'm struggling to actually hook my students into the idea that researching is a worthwhile project. So I'd ask that of the students and of the faculty, and you can tell me after, email me, right, whatever. Okay, thank you.
I don't know if it's so much what hooked me into doing research. I feel like what somebody said earlier, like you don't really need the research if it's your lived experience. I think it was just me talking about my lived experience, my community's lived experience, and then being like, okay, I gotta do the research to like back it up, because I was told I had to. And then when you research this stuff, you're like, okay, I'm not crazy. This is real. Like, there's real numbers to this thing. It's really inequality. It's like embedded in the framework of New York and embedded in the framework of our communities. So I guess it's not so much of I wanted to do research. It's just like I low-key got to get my stuff off, and this is how I feel, and then this is what backs it up. Yeah, so just, I don't know, lived experience.
I feel like something that brought me to do this research was putting a face to the people that's doing the actual work, and just highlighting those people in particular. I specialize in environmental racism. That sounds crazy. I'm not out here doing environmental racism, but I specialize in uncovering. Yes, I'm an expert in environmental racism. I'm not putting factories in the hood or anything like that. but actually, just like I said, putting a face to the people that's doing the actual work. I got really sick and tired of when I turned on the news and it being like a white nonprofit saying, hey, yeah, this is what we're doing. And it's like, you're liars. And I know I keep going back to people lying. I know my grandma would be like, don't say lie. They're fibbers. Like, they're fibbers. It's not the truth. It's the community members that's actually doing the actual work. And I feel like for your students, realizing that, hey, you need to highlight the people that look like you, and that's the ones that's actually doing the work. Don't let people tell your story for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in law school now, so I think, thanks. I'm just sharing that because I frankly forgot a lot. I think about not necessarily what I learned in undergrad, but the humanity of it. I'm just consistently seeing black and white rules and laws. And so when I think about research and when I'm like writing, these legal papers or whatever, I consistently understand or have to understand, I have to learn to speak the language of the oppressor. And that means I have to do my research. That means I have to put this in black and white. It must be read this way in order for it to be translated, in order for it to even exist in the reality that I live in, that my community lives in. And so although research can be a pain, because it's so much fun, sometimes it is, but it's also real. We see these numbers and the line graphs and the bar graphs, but I can understand now, after undergrad, after being taught by these amazing professors, and being now in my second year of law school, of how important those numbers are. It's really hard for us to see it as tangible, but I think the reality of many of the students here in Brooklyn College, and I go to CUNY Law, many of the students there, we don't have to look far to see what those numbers look like, because we are those numbers.
Just quickly, as far as the research and numbers and everything like that, I know personally that helped me look at what I wrote as important, because I wrote it originally, and again, I just kind of felt like I just got a weight off my chest through the process of writing it, and then they were like, okay, you got to have a whole bunch of research and cite a whole bunch of stuff, and it's but going through that process and arriving at the finished product that involved the research and the stats and everything kind of helped me look at my pieces actually being worth more than just,
I know there's some questions still, but I know that some of the writers have places to be. So we're going to wrap it up, and then perhaps if you still have questions, you can ask some of the writers afterwards. Is that a quick question?
It's not a question.
Okay.
Statement. I have my teacher voice. Professor JT mentioned a couple of ways that students can have their writing on campus supported, but I wanted to mention a couple of other places on campus that will support your writing, even give you some financial support as you work through your ideas. The TAO program, there's a TAO research program. You can find a professor, work with a TAO professor and get paid. There's the Rosen Fellowship. If you have an idea for research, the Rosen will give you several $1,000s to develop your research ideas. There's the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship program for students. We will support you in developing your research ideas, and there is a journal that comes out of that. So some of your work can be published. We will find venues for your publishing if we can. I think the English department has a publication vehicle. So anyway, we on campus do want to support the thinking and writing and developing of the writing of our students.
Linda, for that.
I just want to point to the issue of time. Students are always under immense pressure. Taking 5 classes on top of family responsibilities, work, and everything else is some of the most important conversations gets rushed along. So even right now, it's 2 o'clock, people have to rush off. And I think when we start just talking to each other and asking questions about some of these rules, like why do we have to be in such a hurry all the time for something so important as learning, reflecting on experiences that will ultimately lead us to a better place as people and as a university, we start to realize what the central issue is. And I might not know about a program or a professor or somebody who can help me because I'm always in a hurry, right? So when these students are able to write these pieces, it really takes some level of reflection and even time in the moment to say, oh, let me take advantage of this opportunity. More often than not, students are rushed along and say, you have to do this in such a rapid pace, and they don't have time to even, internalize the most basic experience that can come out in the most fruitful way. So I think, the issue and the problem is really right in front of us to say, how do we slow things down in our teaching, but also how we move around as a campus, make time for each other, and ultimately change how we do things on the college level.
Noted. One of the songs that opened the event was Patti Smith's The People Have the Power. And in it she tells us that the people have the power to redeem the work of fools. And I think this book shows us that. You have the power, you have used the pen, you've used your brain, you've used your voice to redeem the work of fools. And we need that in this world. So thank you again for this fantastic and important and empowering book. And thank you for this conversation.
Try to take a picture of